moments.
So how many people?
So we've got a few people, I think they're watching tonight, and then a few people that are going to watch on the weekend because it will record it. But hello to everyone watching. Apologies for the slight delay. We had a few technical difficulties with the sound, but we're all sorted now. So yeah, we're ready for this evening for natural wines, or natural wines as we might call them. But yeah, welcome everybody. And if you've got any questions, please do ask. You can pop them either in the comment box, or I've got the iPad here if you want to drop them on email or Facebook or anything. But yeah, please do ask questions if you've got any. And we've got a really good lineup tonight. So we've got Nic joining us from Modal Wines.
Hello.
These are all wines from his range that he imports in. And yeah, I'll let Nic introduce Modal a little bit and tell you a little bit about themselves as well. So
yeah, so thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to taste through all these interesting wines tonight. So my name is Nic. I run a company called Modal Wines, M-O-D-A-L. We're an importer and distributor based in London, but we supply wines around the country. We don't really have a geographical focus, so we work with growers from about 8 different countries, mainly in Europe. And but I guess the common thread is we have a very strict focus on farming practices. So that's one thing we're very particular about. So every single wine and every single grower that we work with works with organic or biodynamic or beyond in the vineyards. And then they all practice, a kind of low intervention, natural style of winemaking in the cellar, at least as much as possible. So that's kind of the focus of the sort of wines that we supply. But we've always aimed, from the beginning. We've been going for about 4.5 years now. And from the start, the idea was always to be able to supply and to showcase a really diverse range of wines. So, always full of character, but things that range from, the very familiar and accessible to the out there, the left field and quirky and everything in between. So I think the range that we've selected tonight is a really good representation of the various styles of wine that are out there, and also from maybe lesser known grapes, lesser known regions. So I think that there'll be a lot to take away from tonight.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. There's a really lovely lineup of things, and I know we've called it a natural wine tasting. I know people are quite interested in natural wine. It's something that is kind of growing, I suppose, in the wine industry, but it was also quite a difficult thing to sort of pinpoint. And I think we'll go through these wines, and I think people will kind of come out of it thinking, yeah, there's a lot more to natural wine than it just being kind of one specific thing. It's a kind of big umbrella of winemaking and practices that don't really have any kind of to mold, really, which is the beauty of it. There's all sorts of stuff that we're gonna go through. So yeah, it'll be some good wines. But yeah, so which one are we doing first? It's the Riesling first, is it?
Yeah, so we're going to start with the Malinga Riesling. So it's the one with the little orange logo on the label.
So everyone's got little sort of sample bottles. I've got the actual bottle here.
All right, cool. Cool. So this one is this is a wine from Austria. It's from a region called Kamptal, which is in the northeast of Austria. It's one of the northernmost regions in Austria. A lot of the wine growing regions there tend to be in the eastern part of the country. And this is from the northern edge of that region, so of the Kamptal region. And it's from a very young producer. His name is Christoph Heiss. His project is called Malinga. He's around 30 years old at the moment. And he's someone who kind of grew up around wine. He grew up in a winery. His father made wine, and he kind of took over the family domain only a couple of years ago, but started making wines under his own project. I think it was in 2013 was the first wine that he made, which was actually a Riesling. So where he is in Austria, there's a real concentration of a soil type that's called Loess, which is Loess, which is this kind of like crumbly clay sort of soil. I'm not going to get too technical about soil types and too nerdy about vinifications. I think that stuff can get just too technical sometimes. But one thing I will say is that it's a soil type that has like if you pour water on it, it really retains water, so it doesn't really drain much. So you have a lot of water retention, and generally it tends to lead to a certain textural component in the wine. So I think if you're used to a more traditional style of Riesling, or maybe German Riesling, especially stuff made that's more conventionally, you might not expect the kind of texture that this wine has. It's obviously it's certainly not creamy or anything like that, but it's got this lovely kind of textural component. One thing that always strikes me with Rieslings from this region, particularly from Kamtal, is they tend to showcase this sort of like orange fruit character, like tangerine, clementine. It still has a slightly honeyed character. It's still, for me, it still very much has, typicity when it comes to the Riesling variety, but it's got that really unique fruit profile, which is this kind of like clementine with spices and herbs. Very aromatic, very expressive, just super, super Moorish.
So the thing with this is, when you smell it, like you say, it's got that sort of tangerine note. It's the first kind of thing you smell, that really really bright sort of stone fruit and tangerine and things like you said on it, the orange fruits. It's really, really bright on the nose. And we have someone said that if you want to get technical about soil, they're more than happy for it, because they find it really interesting. So there are some people that will love the kind of technical side of things as well. But yeah, I know it's one of the more premium regions for making Riesling.
Well, I think it's and this is definitely like an interesting expression of Riesling, even from Kamtal. I think one thing that I'll quickly touch on, when it comes to the more natural side of winemaking, is that there's, and again, this is getting a bit nerdy, but in vinification, so in winemaking, you have two fermentations. You have the alcoholic fermentation, so the yeast turning sugars into alcohol, which creates wine, and then you have a secondary fermentation called malolactic fermentation, which is where bacteria basically take one type of acid and shape it into a different type of acid. So it's malic acid, for example, like a tart green apple has like that malic acid, sharp acidity, into lactic acid, which is a softer type of acidity, like in yogurt or milk. Now, when sometimes malolactic can be induced by human means, so by adding certain types of bacteria or enzymes to shape the character of a wine to be a certain way. But when it's a natural malolactic fermentation, it doesn't necessarily lead to this kind of creamy, buttery profile that people think. But it does. What it does is it changes the acidic profile a little bit and adds a bit of texture. Now, with wines, with all the wines that we sell, malolactic fermentation is never blocked in the wine. But in Riesling, for example, a lot of German Riesling, well, actually just in Riesling in general, a lot of producers prefer to block malolactic because it helps to retain this like razor sharp sort of character in the wine. But what I've come to learn is that if the grapes are grown in the right way, if the grapes are very healthy, that grown without sprays, the raw material has everything that it needs to go through all of its natural processes and still come out with a beautifully balanced product. So you don't actually lose acidity. This still has really beautiful acidity, but you get the advantage of that slightly more textural component. So, which to me adds a bit of complexity to the wine, and just makes it more of a joy to drink.
I was going to say, because I've just done my level 3 WSET exam, and in that they teach you how to do sort of blind tasting, and they teach you that if it's had malolactic fermentation, particularly with whites, then you're going to get butter, cream, like all those kind of rich notes on there. But as you say, with this, you don't get that kind of like creaminess that you would usually associate with that conventional winemaking with it. So, and it's just really fresh acidity still on it.
Exactly. I think it's a misconception, and it's true. I did the WSETs as well, and they teach you that, one of the things to detect malolactic is that kind of buttery, textural, creamy kind of component, which does happen in some wines. And I think that's more common if you induce malolactic fermentation by additions, right? But if you let it go through natural processes, chances are you're not going to get as much of a pronounced buttery, creamy character. And I think this wine is a perfect example of that. And I've come to actually much prefer, especially Riesling, because Riesling is just so it's so common for people to block malolactic in Riesling that the textbook Riesling character is actually different from a lot of the Rieslings that I tend to prefer, which are Rieslings that have been naturally fermented and that have gone through malolactic fermentation.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think this is one that will age as well? Obviously, Riesling is very famous for aging and sort of developing those kerosene notes on it. Do you think it's something that will lengthen and age as well?
Yeah, I don't think it will. I don't think it will age for too long. This is so he makes 3 Rieslings. This is the first of the Riesling. So this is the one that he vinifies. This one's aged in steel tank, so there's no barrels here. It's an inert vessel. So this is very much what you're tasting is the very pure kind of fruit character. And it's from some of his younger vines, so you still get a lot of complexity. It's really really interesting. I think, like, ideally, I would drink this within the next 5 years. That would be sort of my, which for a white, is pretty good. But I don't think this is a wine that you could lay down for like 10, 15, 20 years. I think some of his other Rieslings you could probably age a bit longer. But I think this one's already so open. It's already so gorgeous, and it already has a little bit of age on it. It's a 2018. So
there's that ever so slight note of it, just like slightly, just kind of under the fruit, that you get that little tiny bit of almost kerosene coming through, but not kind of crazy amounts. Because I think that's one of the things with Riesling. There's a bit of a joke about it when you work in the wine industry. Like, nobody's surprised that you love Riesling, but then from a customer point of view, I'm not sure it's always like kind of the wine that people go to or think is the most accessible. And I ever wonder if it's just because of the kind of connotations that are linked to it, whether it be sweet or whether it be really petrol-y. So this is nice, kind of, it's got that real juiciness, but character, like you say, as well. It's not just pure juice or just pure kind of petrol, which I think people associate that with. So
yeah, I think that there's a softness to it that for me makes it such a pleasure to drink. Like, it's such a it's a really wonderful wine to just sit and drink and not think too much about.
Good summer's wine for a hot day like today. But yeah, really good that. Price wise, just thinking I should probably tell you the prices of these as well as we go along. So we've got all these in stock, because one of the things that obviously that I know that we know from our point of view, but for everyone watching, is that the wines that Nic gets are usually really small batch, so we will get stuff in, and he sometimes things will go out of stock, or it might move on to a different vintage, and they sort of change quite, they grow quite organically in a way as well, which I think is something quite important, that you don't kind of go for just the conventional year-on-year same sort of thing. Even the big popular ones that we've got coming up later, that each year they are slightly different as well. So this one is $26.95 a bottle. There it is. Yeah, really lovely. So which one's your favorite out of his range? Is it some of the older ones, or is that too hard to
I think it really depends on the occasion, I love all his wines. He makes a really amazing red, super juicy Zweigelt as well. I don't know if you've tried that one, Hannah. But his Gruner Veltliner is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
That one's a little bit touch more creamy, a bit more maybe more intense in a way, so less fruity. Like the Riesling is very fruity. And then he makes a really old vines, like single parcel, tiny production Riesling, which is his top Riesling, which usually takes like 2 years to ferment. It's a natural fermentation, and it's just, he ferments everything in a very cold, in like an underground cellar where you have a very steady temperature. So he goes for these really slow fermentations because yeasts tend to be a lot more active in slightly warmer temperatures. But this particular Riesling, I guess it's just the vineyard itself, and the yeast that come from the vineyard are just very, very slow. So he's just released the 2017 vintage, which took 2.5 years to ferment. So he bottled that, I think towards the end, he bottled that last summer. So summer of 2020, 2017 vintage.
The flavor on that must be insane if it's taken that long to ferment.
Yeah, it's that wine. It's pretty spectacular, and it ferments and ages in a 500 liter an old barrel. Nice. That's maybe my favorite, but again, it's a kind of wine that it's not like an everyday sort of wine. I wouldn't just open that just to have a drink.
It's not something you'd save that bottle. You wouldn't give it to your friend that's just come around that's going to quaff it, basically.
No, you would if it was the right occasion, but it's quite complex, so you have to be careful with what you pair it with. And I think sometimes the most enjoyable wines are the slightly more entry level. I mean, obviously this is not entry level, but the slightly more juicy, fresh kind of wines. You don't. Some of the more complex wines sometimes aren't necessarily the most enjoyable.
Yeah. Sometimes you have to. They're the type of wines you have to take the time to think about and actually be like, right, what am I kind of drinking here? Which on some occasions is great, but then other times, like you say, if you're with a group of friends or it's a long day, it's really hot, and you think, oh, I fancy a glass. You don't really want to sit and just always kind of think, what am I drinking here? How am I analysing this? So. You touched on it briefly then. What would you recommend pairing with this? Obviously, Riesling is quite food friendly. It will go with a range of things, but anything in particular you've had food wise that you think that's a fantastic pairing? Or
so I think this wine in particular, it's a variety of things. I think so generally when it comes to pairings, I think we'll probably touch on this with some of the other wines, but I'm not super particular about pairings because it's kind of an impossible science in a way. There's like the pairings that everyone knows kind of works. Your champagne and oysters and things like that. Yeah. But all it takes is like a tiny little herb in a dish or a little sauce or something to just completely throw off a pairing. So I always say if you're drinking wine and really enjoying it, and then you have a bite of food and you go back to the wine, and then you've noticed that the wine has really changed for the worse, then obviously there's a bit of a clash there. Just leave the wine aside, finish your food, and then go back to the wine. That's always been my thing. It's just I try not to get too intricate or complex about wine pairings. However, this particular wine works really beautifully with curries, so with certain types of Asian food, Thai food. Some Indian foods, but also works really well with things like ceviche, like raw, like kind of raw fish, sushi, and again, just with fish, even chicken. You can have this with like a roast chicken, and it would be a fantastic pairing. So quite versatile.
Yeah, lovely. Yeah, you can't go wrong with Riesling. Hopefully, this shows why we all love Riesling in the wine industry. So yeah, it's one of those favorite, but yeah, really, really like that. It's like I say, it's got that kind of real juicy sort of character, but the acidity in there as well to stop it from just being pure juice. Should we move on to the next one?
Yeah.
Right, so let me grab it out the fridge. So the next one, I believe, was this one, wasn't it? The Giancu. That's how you say it.
Er Giancu.
My pronunciation is not very good.
It's local Ligurian dialect. So in Italy, it means the white wine, basically. So it's like the white and the red. So it just means the white wine. Giancu means white. So this is quite a special wine, and it comes from a very special place in the northwest of Italy, so in the Liguria region, and it comes from the Cinque Terre. So for those of you who are familiar with this region, it's a World UNESCO Heritage Site. It's a series of 5 tiny little rock perched villages on cliffs that are basically on the sea. Very, very old villages, and a region that's arguably a lot more famous for tourism than it is for wine. However, there's a really rich and ancient viticultural history there going back to Roman times. Even in those times, like especially the sweet wines from this region were prized as some of the best wines in the world at the time. Well, in Italy, let's just say. If we go back to the turn of the 20th, so the beginning of the 20th century, there was about 1,200 hectares under vine in the region, and that's now dwindled to less than 100 hectares. So it's really been like a disappearing tradition in the Cinque Terre, which is very sad. But it's all because the vineyards there are so hard to work. It takes so much manual labor, and a lot of the younger generations just aren't willing to go through that, especially because the rewards aren't necessarily what they could have been. I guess going back a century or two ago, and So what we're talking about here is basically very, very steep vineyards that are on very rocky soils, on sandstone soils, that are literally, that just plunge straight into the sea. So if you Google image Cinque Terre, just so you get a vibe, I mean, it's absolutely stunning landscapes, but like, you know, it's literally heroic viticulture. Some of these vineyards are so steep that they've had to build, a lot of the winemakers who've been there for a while, built these little trams, like little monorail systems that take them down and up so they can get grapes up during harvest, and that it takes them down into the vineyards because they're so hard and so steep to work. So the soils are of volcanic origin. It's a soil type that they call arenaria, which is a type of sandstone. What you have to remember here with this wine is, for me, it's one of those rare wines that really takes you straight to the place. It's a region that has its own local varieties that literally don't exist anywhere else. So this is 2 varieties. It's dominant in Albarola, and then it's 80%, and then it has 20% Bosco. So like I said, 2 very local varieties. And these are like wind battered slopes that, you know, there's sea salt all over these grapes, like by the time they harvest them. And for me, you can really taste that sea salt in the wine. It's such like
I found a video that you put on Instagram of it a while ago. I don't know if anyone can see that properly.
Yeah.
Of it. And like, it is literally on the sea. Like, yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, that was me riding that little monorail tram. It was absolutely terrifying, but you know, you had to do it for the footage. So this is a wine. So he vinified. This is a winemaker called Heidi Bonanini. The project is called Possa. He is one of only 20 winemakers left in the Cinque Terre. So he's in the specific village that he's in is called Rio Maggiore. It's the last of the, like, going from north to south. It's the very last one, and he's one of the very last winemakers who's really working as per very ancient traditions. So he's one of the only ones working completely naturally. So these wines are what you call 0-0. So meaning there's 0 chemicals, 0 inputs in the vineyard, and then 0 inputs and 0 additions in the winery. So there's no additions of sulfites, there's no corrections on fine, on filter. This is as natural as it gets. And as per ancient tradition, all of the wines went through a little bit of skin contact. So it doesn't necessarily go super orange, but this is vinified with 25 days of skin contact. And what we mean by that is that in white wine, normally when the grapes arrive, they're pressed immediately. So what happens is like imagine if you're making like a fresh squeezed orange juice, where you would just like squeeze everything out, but then you have a little filter that collects the pulp and the seeds and all that. It's a similar process in winemaking. So when you hear about pressing, it's this kind of like, well, there's different types of presses, but the concept is that you basically squeeze everything out, but the skins and the pulp and the seeds get left behind. And so what happens is you end up with a clear liquid. And when you ferment that, you get white wine. But if you just crush the grapes and then ferment everything with the skins on them, then what happens is during the fermentation, it will extract a bit of color. It will extract some different flavor compounds, some phenolics, some antioxidants, and it gives the wine a very different profile. So this is 25 days of fermentation with the skins, and then it's aged in steel tanks. So it's quite a basic vinification after the skin contact. But for me, it's so unique. It's a wine that just absolutely screams of where it's from. It's complex, it's long, it's a proper journey through the palate. It's got concentration, but it's got freshness. And when people talk about like minerality in wine, you know, it's usually associated with this kind of like stony or saltiness at the end. And for me, this is just absolutely supercharged with that. It's kind of like, imagine like just, you know, jumping into the sea and coming out, you know, that's kind of what I get from drinking wine.
Yeah, it's like you're at the beach and you've just had like this lovely fruit salad and gone in the sea and gone to swim around and then got out and then had something really refreshing afterwards. I have a bit of a habit of elaborating on sort of tasting notes like that. Unfortunately, that's not what I was allowed to do for WSET, but sometimes it helps you kind of understand it in a way. But yeah, it's really, I've had this before and found then there's just so many layers to this wine. Like it just keep on giving. It's so complex, but as you say, like it does because when you know where it comes from as well, but you get that sense of real. It kind of clicks when you drink it. And you're like, oh yeah, I can really taste that it's from, you know, the very edge of the on the coast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I just for me, it's so unique. You know, like unique is a very abused word in the wine trade. But I really truly think this is one of the rare examples where it really rings true.
So it's got a good mouth texture as well. So I think sometimes as well, when you think of like wines that can be kind of described as minerally or have got that minerality on there, they tend to be those sort of slightly lighter wines or things that don't tend to have that kind of texture on there as well. Sometimes, but this has got that, it's got, like I say, it's got mouthfeel on it, it's got fruit, and it's got layers of complexity, really gentle tannin as well on it.
And a lovely kind of herbal, like a lovely herbal sort of edge to it as well. And it's a wine, so I don't know how big the samples are that you sent to people, but it's a wine that really like evolves, you know, over the course of a day or two. It's got this beautiful evolution.
So we, because people were picking them up today and yesterday, we did bottle them the other day. So it kept it refrigerated. So it should obviously keep it very fresh.
Nice.
But at the same time, it should hopefully have opened up a bit and evolved. And the one that I'm drinking now is one of the ones we've opened, and it definitely has got this real kind of character to it that you know, it's not sort of one-dimensional wine by any means. Price-wise, this is about £29, £30 a bottle. But there's a red version as well, which I know Jeff's had, and he thought it was really good as well. So
cool. And this is this is a tiny, you know, as you can imagine, a very tiny estate. It's about 4.5 hectares. It's a one-man operation. A guy that, you know, biodiversity is, I think it's like the definition of biodiversity should be his vineyard. I've never seen so much life in a vineyard. He grows all of his fruits and vegetables like amongst the vines, and it's like on a slope like this. He's got like 60 different types of herbs. He's an award-winning beekeeper as well, and makes honey. So, it's such a beautiful, absolutely beautiful place. It's basically, it starts at about 150 meters of altitude, and then it just goes straight down to the sea. So that the last 2 rows of his vineyard have to be harvested by boat every year. Like, so this little rowboat, they take a little rowboat, and it's also, you know, it probably doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but it's part of like a tradition that they've always done. So it's like the very beginning of harvest is signaled by that rowboat. You know, they take the first 2 rows, they bring it back by rowboat, and that's kind of like, that signifies the start of their harvest.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really interesting wine, and you know, like, I had a comment saying like the backstory of it as well is really fascinating, because you don't, you know, while you do get sort of coastal winemaking areas, you don't ever think that they are quite literally on the sea and have, you know, the last couple of rows have to be harvested by boat. But yeah, it's a fascinating wine. I just keep getting so much different stuff on it now.
Yeah, this is definitely one of those wines that you can just sit there and smell and talk about for ages. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to ask, you mentioned that he grows a lot in between his vineyards.
Yeah.
In the vineyards, in between the vines and things as well. And do you often find that the more people are doing that, or the more that they're growing in the vineyard, how does it usually affect the wine? Do you find that it has quite an influence on the final wines or the terroir as well, because he's growing other sort of things in there?
Yeah, well, I think you know, I guess a big focus of a lot of the growers that I work with is just biodiversity in general, moving away from monoculture. So whether it's, you know, we could literally have a whole session just about that, right? Like permaculture, regenerative agriculture, agroforestry, and there's so many different ways to approach that. But generally, the more diverse a soil is, the more different types of bugs and pests you'll have on there. The different, you know, you have plants that, you know, every plant has a certain function within a vineyard. So some might be, you know, helping to sequester carbon in the soil. Some might be like cover crops that maybe help with getting more nitrogen into the soil. So the idea is to have as close to like a self-balancing ecosystem as possible. So if you think about like a conventionally grown vineyard where the soil is just bare, everything is stripped, and all you have are just some vines clinging onto life, then of course those soils will need all sorts of inputs. So they'll need chemical fertilizers, they'll need fungicides and pesticides, and because there's nothing to, how should I put this? It's like in a healthy vineyard that's super diverse, both with plants and bugs and animals and mammals and everything. Every sort of, well, not every, but in a lot of cases, the bad pests are eaten by other pests that are eaten by other pests that are then eaten by this, that then die because of this. So it's kind of like you don't necessarily need all of these inputs because it's kind of a self-regulating ecosystem. Of course, it takes a long time to achieve that, especially if you're taking over a vineyard that was farmed conventionally. The process of getting to that sort of stage is quite tough, and you could go through a few, 2 or 3 challenging years, maybe lowered yields, which is why I think a lot of people are hesitant to convert. But once they do, those plants are so much more resilient to things like drought, to disease, and so it's for me. There's no question as to what the correct way of growing, anything is, not just grapes.
Do the vines as well then, because there's also there's also kind of competition within the ground as well, they're not the only thing planted there, do they then have to work a little bit harder? So do you think that it's almost like the fruit that then they are producing is almost more concentrated because they're having to work harder and fight for nutrients and water for other things as well?
Well, it's definitely a healthier fruit. It's a fruit that won't have had any kind of bad things sprayed on it. And then in terms of concentration, maybe not necessarily concentration, but it will have more of the natural elements that it needs to create a very balanced wine naturally, right? So a better balance of, maybe concentration to acidity, tannins, all of those things play a big part in how the finished product works. But you can't ignore the human elements. There's a human behind all this that has to make a lot of, a series of very important and substantial decisions that will completely shape the character of a wine. So when you talk about terroir and where a wine comes from, and of course the place is an important part of it, but then arguably equally as important is the process that the human behind it goes through to shape it into the wine, right? So, but generally, I think grapes that come from a more biodiverse vineyard that's been grown without chemical sprays generally will lead to a better wine. I think there's no question about that. Yeah,
it's interesting. There are some people that
I'm going to go and turn on a light real quick before I disappear.
No, it's an interesting one because there are some people that seem to think kind of, natural wine. They think, oh, it's just all like smells like farmyard, and it's just lazy winemaking. There's a few people I've heard say that. They kind of come in and they'll say, oh yeah, this is natural, and they're like, oh, I don't want anything to do with that. But I don't think. This is why this is great that we can have this be and kind of debunk natural wines a little bit, because as I say, there's a lot more to it, and it isn't just a case of that they're organic and then that's it. There's a lot more to it, isn't there? So
I think there's a real misconception about natural wine in general. What it is. First of all, there's no kind of agreed definition, but I think there's the misconception. People think that all natural wines are funky or maybe have certain kind of strange smells, flavors, that they're all cloudy, that some of them are fizzy. And of course some of them are, but there is an enormous range of natural wines. And I think hopefully through the wines that we're going to taste tonight, if any of you do have some of those misconceptions, that maybe we can prove you wrong. Because we sell some wines that are, some of the funkier kind, but at the same time, we have a whole range of wines that you can put in front of anybody, and you would not know, it was anything different to maybe what you're used to drinking. I still think there's a big difference in terms of the purity and the balance, and you can feel that there's a different textural feel to natural wines, but you'll see. I'll talk you through that as we taste some of the next few wines.
Lovely. So shall we move on to the next one?
Yeah.
Pomagrana next?
I think so. Yeah, Pomagrana.
Yay! We're excited. Whenever this lands in store, we're just like, yes!
This is a wine that arrives every year, usually in like June, maybe beginning of June. This year it was late. It arrived in July this year, and it tends to stick around until maybe like October time maybe.
Yeah.
So this is a super interesting wine. Definitely a fridge. It's a fridge red, right? So a chilled red, and it's a wine that comes to us from the Penedès region in Catalonia, in Spain. It's made from so actually the specific region is called Conca de Barberà. It's known for the grape variety Trepat, which is Trepat. So this wine is made from 100% Trepat. It's a red grape variety, but it's a variety that has super thin skins and doesn't tend to give much color in a wine. So I think, well, more and more now you're starting to see examples made from 100% Trepat, but it's generally a grape that hasn't been very common as a single varietal wine. And I think the reason is that it just gives such little color. Generally, the Spanish market tends to like, slightly more fuller-bodied wines. But it's a grape that I find fascinating and that the winemakers find fascinating. So the project is called Lectores Vini. It's two friends, a guy called Freddy Torres and his friend Mark Lecha. So Lecha, Torres, Lectores, they kind of put their two names and put it together. And it's a very basic vinification. So it's fermented and aged in steel. It's about 2 weeks on the skin, so it picks up a little bit of color. And a wine that they always bottle in around April, roughly April time. So and yeah, it's quite particular. It's what a lot of people call a glue wine, right? Like glug, because it's a wine that's, it's low alcohol, it's very juicy, it's very easy to drink. I think it's the perfect wine for the weather that we're experiencing at the moment. It's like the proper park wine. It's great as an aperitif. It's great with a lot of different types of foods. Some people even serve it as like on the rosé section of their list. I mean, it's kind of like that, like light red, dark rosé, because it has probably more in common with a rosé than it does with a red. But what I really like about it is that it really has its own unique fruit profile, and that for me is that for me really makes it stand out. It's got this kind of it's like pomegranate, obviously Pomagrana. It's because it has this pomegranate sort of character, this like tart sort of cherry. And like cranberry as well. I find it's got this like cranberry, granite, a little bit of spice, but nothing too complex. This is like a session. This is like if there's beer lovers out there, this would be like your session ale version of.
I like that. I'm gonna use that. Like this is your session IPA of wine. But yeah. See, this year, so I had a bottle last year because whenever it comes out, I'm like, and it's sunny, I'm like, I need a bottle. But this year, though, it smells a lot more sort of spiced, but in that kind of like almost slightly like fennelly kind of way. I don't know, it's quite different to last year actually, which from what I remember, because last year I remember it being really juicy, but I mean it was a year ago, and I did drink it quite quickly. But yeah,
I think it's got maybe a little bit more fruit density this year, but still, still in the vibe of like very juicy, very fresh. So an interesting wine, because a lot of people don't associate reds with drinking straight out of the fridge. So this is example of actually a category that I think is gaining a lot of popularity nowadays, which is this kind of chilled red category. So reds that are made with certain varieties that really lend themselves to being vinified in this super light red kind of style. And Trepat just happens to be fantastic for that.
And the thing as well with it being a Spanish red, it's not, usually Spanish red, you kind of go Rioja, Ribera del Douro, those type of things. There's really big, full, heavily extracted wines, and this is complete opposite. And it's this is about £23 ish, and we have it in magnums as well, which is just the most fun. We haven't got much in magnums. We've got a bit of this, but I'm assuming you've got quite good stocks of this at the moment.
Yes, we do. Yeah, we do. It's the kind of wine you want to have good stocks of during summertime for sure.
Yeah, definitely. But even so, I mean, there are times when we will sell it kind of into the winter, but as you say, by October time, it does tend to kind of run out. And it is one that we sort of wait for year on year. Almost like a Beaujolais Nouveau that kind of comes out like that. We sell the stock until the next vintage comes out for it. But yeah, this is one of our favorites. We generally always have this in the summer. So
yeah, I think it's lovely. It's funny you mentioned Beaujolais Nouveau or Beaujolais in general, because some of the really light kind of these other new styles of wine. There's a lot of it that comes from Beaujolais. And those wines are fantastic, but they have a very different sort of fruit profile. And I think this is a great alternative to that kind of. It's much less red fruited, much less kind of raspberry, strawberry. But much more like kind of like what we in the wine world call crunchy fruit. It's like cranberry, slightly more tart kind of fruit, pomegranate.
It's the thing with sort of Beaujolais Nouveau and some of the Nouveau styles. We have some of the Novello stuff as well, the Italian stuff, but that generally tends to be a little bit heavier, even heavier than this. But the Nouveau stuff can often be very, it can be a bit of it can kind of split people. They kind of either love it or they're just not keen on it. And when they're not keen on that kind of kirsch and banana sort of flavor in it. But this doesn't have any of that, but it's that really light sort of, easy drinking red, as my colleague Virginia, who you met the other week, would say, a patio pounder. That's what she would call it. Or what Americans used to call it. But yeah. It's just so the spice on it is really nice though. Really good. So yeah. But yeah, we love Pomegranate. Pretty Taurus as well. He makes good wines pretty Taurus under his own label.
It's hard. It's a wine that's hard not to enjoy. Yeah,
exactly. I don't think there's much to say about it really, because it's just one of those you just got to enjoy and drink. But, yeah. But, okay, I'm going to stop drinking it now. I've got to drive home. Otherwise, I will finish it. But yeah.
So that was kind of like a really good, I guess, palate refresher to lead us into the two reds the two other reds that we're gonna try. So I think we're gonna do the Mégalithe now.
This one.
Yes.
This one I'm excited for as well.
Yes. Have you tried it yet, or is this going to be your first time?
This is the first time I've tried this one because it's a new vintage, isn't it? So, but yeah,
So this is this comes to us from Burgundy, obviously a very popular region in France, in the sort of central east of France. And it's a region that's better known for Pinot Noir, for Chardonnay, arguably some of the most expensive and most revered expressions of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. But if you go a bit further south, in southern Burgundy, in the Mâconnais, right, so in the Mâcon region, there you'll find a lot of this grape variety, which is Gamay, which is obviously the dominant variety. If you continue to go south and go into Beaujolais. But in Mâcon and the kind of regions surrounding it, I've always found super, super interesting because you still have some fantastic Pinot Noir, some delicious Chardonnay, but then you get the additional advantage of seeing a lot of Gamay there. And Gamay is just such a delicious grape variety. Now, Gamay is best known for the Beaujolais, right? So the Beaujolais expressions, which are very different from the way that he makes this wine. So in Beaujolais, I guess a very common practice is the vinification style of carbonic maceration, which again, without going into too much detail, is basically a style where the wine is vinified with all whole bunches. So they put 100% whole clusters, so the bunches of the grapes, in an environment without oxygen, where a kind of a fermentation starts within the clusters, which then breaks them open, and the fermentation kicks off in the tank from that. And you get a different kind of fruit profile with that, and generally a slightly lighter style of wine. Now, he purposely did not want to make wine like that just to kind of, he's got slightly different soils than you have in Beaujolais, but he also wanted to have a kind of differentiation into the style of Gamay from his region. So he still does use a few whole bunches, 70% whole bunches, but then he gets in there and he foot stomps the grapes. He goes for a little bit more extraction. And by extraction, we mean a little bit more fruit density, a little bit more tannic structure, a little bit more body, right? So this is still like a light and fresh wine. I'd say it's kind of like on the lighter end of medium bodied. I don't know if you would agree, Hannah. Some people even say it's just light bodied, but I think there's a bit of structure there to kind of make it more of a medium bodied wine.
Yeah, if we're talking on the WSET lexicon, it would be a medium minus body.
Yeah, there you go. And I think it's really interesting because it definitely has strong gamay characteristic. Like it's got that really like bright fruit, that really like exciting juicy fruit profile on the nose. You smell it and just you know it's going to be juicy. But then the palate gives you a bit more layers and a bit more structure than you'd normally find in a Beaujolais style. And I think this is I find this wine fascinating. I think it's very elegant. It's dense without being heavy. It gives you a lot in the context of a lighter wine, if that makes sense.
Well, if you compare the two, we just had the Pomagrana, which is obviously very, very light, very kind of fruity, and this is still one that is a lighter body, but there is quite a difference in them. You know, the sort of tannic structure in the two wines is much different, and you can sort of really feel it on the palate afterwards. But no, it's a really lovely kind of well-rounded wine, I think, actually. Like you said, it's got a lot of fruit, but
so this is from another very small estate. It's around 4 hectares, and it's a guy called Peter Grozuski. So he's a first-generation Burgundian, but of Polish heritage. So his parents moved to France from Poland, but he was born there. Grew up in Burgundy, and he's one interesting thing about him is he's a geobiology enthusiast. Now, I did not know much about geobiology until I met him and kind of spent a bit of time with him, and he explained it to me. But it's a study of the relationship of the forces of the Earth's core with the cosmos, right? So it's quite scientific, very intricate. And one thing that he did in the parcel that this wine comes from is that there was one particular part that he noticed after a few years that just he felt really lacked vitality. There was something not quite right. And so he actually got a few of his kind of geobiology friends over, and they did all these measurements and found basically specific places where they ended up placing these 3-ton menhirs, so these giant granite boulders at 3 strategic spots of the vineyard to like harness certain types of energies. And what he said is that almost overnight, it just completely changed the character of the vigor of the vines, the quality of the grapes in that particular part of the vineyard. So that's why there's a boulder on the label of the wine. That's what that represents, and with the kind of the circular, the energy. But what's quite cool with him as well is he's north of Mâcon. He's in the Mâcon village appellation, specifically Mâcon Bray, B-R-A-Y. And he's very far from that kind of monoculture world of northern Burgundy, where it's literally just all you see is vines all around, because those like soils and those regions are so prized and expensive. But where he is, he's actually at quite high altitude. It's 400 meters, which is very high for the region. And he's surrounded by forests and cattle farmers, and it just feels like you're just literally in the middle of nature where he is, and it's kind of like he's in his own little unique little corner of Burgundy, where he's what I think are world-class wines. And his Chardonnays are fantastic. His Pinot Noir is sublime. But the Gamay, I think, is just such an enjoyable wine, like juicy, but still with enough character that it's not just like a juicy light red.
It's a really interesting style of Gamay, because even in like the Cru Beaujolais, where the extraction and the winemaking is more traditional and you get more tannin and thing in it, it's still not. I don't know. It still seems quite different to those. It still seems like it's got a lot of life and vibrancy in it, which is really interesting. And also with it being Burgundy, I think I put on the sheet that we print out to put in the boxes, like, Burgundy, but not as you know it, because Burgundy is often quite a daunting region in a way. It can be one of those regions that you either kind of, some people know and they love and they know all the intricacies of it, and other people haven't, they sort of shy away from it because it's not a particularly open and welcoming region. Or the wines can be very austere, they can be very kind of very, very refined, very elegant, but also very, very expensive, some of them as well. So this is a really nice sort of an alternative to to showcase what Burgundy is also, what else they can make there, because it's not just all about Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and the cruise and the Premier cruise, etc. of Northern Burgundy. There's a lot more to it, and even I think people often think, the further south you get, the kind of the quality sort of lessens, if that makes sense, which obviously isn't the case. So yeah, but what type of soil is it in that particular area? Is it?
So this is it's limestone. So it's dominated by limestone and clay. So he's got a bit of clay on the upper layer. He's also got a bit of marl in some of the parcels, but this one's mainly limestone and clay.
Mainly limestone, yeah. No, it's a
And there's because this is one main parcel, the one that has the boulders on it, but he's also got this tiny little plot of 80-year-old vines that's on granite that goes into, it probably represents like 5% of the wine.
Yeah.
There's a couple of interesting little plots that he has. I'm trying to convince him to do like a micro minification of some of these interesting plots, but we'll see how that works out.
Yeah. Really interesting. I'm guessing as well he doesn't use any oak on this at all. It's just all pure stainless steel.
So it's fermented in steel and it's actually aged in oak, but it's a foudre. It's like a 1,000 liter, like the kind of like the ones. It's not a barrel. It's one of those sort of like truncated. But it's 1,000 liters and it's very old. So there's zero oak flavoring. Let's just put it that way. Yeah. But it helps with the roundness of the wine a little bit.
Yeah. And with obviously with a lot of Burgundy, the idea is the premium kind of Burgundies and things like that, you can age them and then they develop these like earthy sort of characters. Where Gamay tends to get a bit of a reputation for not having the same kind of length in terms of aging. How do you think something like this would age? Again, do you think it's something that would benefit from being drunk quite young, or do you think it could go with the length?
Not necessarily. Obviously, I think it's drinking beautifully right now. It's juicy, it's fresh, it's well balanced. But it does have good acidity and it also has good structure, more structure than a lot of the, your kind of everyday Gamay. Generally, Gamay isn't the kind of grape that you can think of just laying down for like 10, 20 years, even though, there are, of course, examples that can easily go the distance and taste absolutely, incredible. I would say this one I'd love to actually taste this in 5 to 10 years. I think it could be something super interesting, Yeah. It'll probably reach its peak around 5 years time, but then like, I'd be curious to see the development, on its way down.
See where it goes from there. Yeah. And like a lot of the wines that you import, as you say, they're minimal kind of intervention in the cellar, as well as obviously in the vineyard. And one of the things that a lot of winemakers who are minimal intervention are doing is choosing not to add too much sulfur. Obviously, with some of them, you mentioned about this one about it not having any added sulfur whatsoever. And one thing that's always really good about your wines is whenever we get new wines in, Nic will always send a full text sheet and it will break down everything and it will tell you if it's vegan friendly or if it's how much sulfur's in it, to the exact amount, which is always really helpful, especially as there's quite a few people that are after no sulfite wines or low sulfite wines. But generally speaking, do most of the winemakers and the people that you work with, do they sort of favor towards adding just a little bit of sulfur pre-bottling to help with the stabilization, or do they does it just depend year on year depending on the harvest and the grapes?
It depends year on year, and it depends on the wine. So it's the thing with sulfur additions, I mean, the one thing is that the vast majority of the winemakers I work with are not dogmatic about the use of sulfites, right? Which for me is quite important, because I work with a lot of winemakers who make wines with no added sulfites, every year. Not necessarily the same wines every year, but every year, if there's a wine that they feel has the balance and has a stability, people tend to test wines, before they bottle them. They leave them, open for a while, see how stable they are, and decide whether or not they bottle it with no additions. I love working with people like that, because then there's more of a consistency and certainty that the wine will be stable, will be, somewhat clean. Sulfites, again, it's a subjective topic, and I always say that for me, the holy grail of wine is a wine that is like super precise, super clean, super stable, but that's been made with absolutely no additions. That for me is always the holy grail of wine. Yeah. I would still rather that a winemaker add a tiny little bit of sulfites, maybe just before bottling, if they feel that the wine needs it just for that extra bit of stability and safety. The wine has to travel all over the world. It's going to be in a lot of different hands, in a lot of service environments. It might be open for 3 or 4 days if it's poured by the glass somewhere, or over days that it's closed, that there's restaurants closed. So the idea with what makes a wine natural in a way, for some people natural has to be 0, no additions. But I think that generally the accepted definition is that it's wines that are with obviously grown organic at the minimum in the vineyard, and then made with absolutely no corrections, so nothing added, nothing taken away, except for that just tiny little dose of sulfites if necessary at the bottling stage. And we're talking about, if you talk about a white wine where I think the legal limit, if I'm not mistaken, is 250 or 300 parts per million of sulfites. Here we're talking about wines where the total sulfites is under 20 parts per million. So it's like 10 to 20. The vast majority of the wines we sell are in that range, even though they might have had absolutely nothing added. Even though they might have had a small sulfite addition. So that's kind of, I would say, most of my winemakers have or still do make 1 or 2 wines every year with absolutely no addition, but they will always favor a small addition should they feel that the wine demands it. Yeah. And I'm very much aligned with that concept. I think that stability in a wine is very important. And I'm not saying I'm not saying that wines with no additions are necessarily less stable. It all depends on the year. It depends on the conditions. I think if you have a dogma about never adding sulfites, I just think it's so challenging to be able to replicate and do like a great product year after year, because you might have a year where there's not enough nutrients in your fermentations and there's problems, or you end up with a bit of residual sugar in the wine that can lead to re-fermentation in the bottle, or there's all sorts of things that can happen when you're making wine naturally and without a formula and without an arsenal of products and things. So I think that that little dose of that kind of antioxidant, antiseptic effect of supplements, I think is great. As long as it's like an absolute minimum, because the minute you get into the sort of like 40, 50, 60, 70 parts per million, you really feel the difference in the wine. You can smell it. At least I can. I think I'm probably because I'm so used to drinking wines that are so low or with nothing. But there's a significant difference for me in the finish of a wine, the way the wine goes down. You can really feel whether there's been a bit too much of the use of sulfites in a wine.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic, and it's actually quite a complex topic. And we do get a few sort of customers that are allergic to sulfites, or they're looking to cut sulfites out, so they're not looking. They don't want to put them into their diet, and it can be quite a bad. You can have quite bad allergic reactions to it, and things like that if you are sort of properly allergic to it. But then I do think there are some customers that sort of see the idea of, if I have a wine without sulfites, I won't get a hangover. This is going to be great. And Yeah, that's not necessarily how it works, unfortunately. That would be great if that's how it did, but and I think sometimes people sort of see something, they kind of associate sulfites as being completely bad, and why don't understand why they're being used. But as you say, tiny amounts just to add that sort of stabilization are sometimes necessary, and it's quite, as I say, quite a complex kind of thing to explain. It's something you could do a whole session on. But yeah, it's a not an easy thing to sort of work out sulfites, but it's something that I think people are kind of interested in. And there's a few wines that are kind of out there that sort of label themselves, and they're like, yeah, zero SO2 in here, zero sulfites. And you think, if you've not got any sulfites in whatsoever, that's also a slight worry, because you do get them as a byproduct of fermentation. So you should always have a level of them in the wine as well. But depending on how they've, if they've tinkered them to remove them completely, then I would just sort of steer clear of that wine and go for something with a little bit of sulfite addition. Obviously, if it's naturally stable and they don't need to add it, then great, you've got a fantastic wine. So yeah, it's just an interesting kind of topic, and as we're obviously talking about natural wine, it's something that
it is, and it's quite divisive as well. A lot of people have very strong opinions about the use of sulfites. I keep a very open mind towards it, but I'm certainly not dogmatic about the addition of a tiny amount. I have absolutely no problem with that. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, there are, because I've come across some people, like you say, that are very much like, a natural wine should have no sulfites in whatsoever, and nothing added. And then you sometimes try some of the wine and you think, oh, that seems a little bit, a little bit unbalanced, and like it's not particularly happy, and sometimes it does just need something to kind of calm it down a little bit. But yeah, it's a really.
It's subjective. There are when you said earlier, like some wines that are a bit farmy or smelling and stuff like that, like that's one person's perception of that wine, but then another person that might be like, that's the profile that people look for in the wine, So again, I lean more towards the kind of more slightly clean and precise side of things, but that's just my personal opinion. It's completely subjective. Some people much prefer the slightly more, farmy examples.
Yeah, and I think the thing as well that thing that sometimes I've come across, and what I've kind of learned with sort of studying wine as well, is that you obviously recognize things that when you're tasting and smelling, you recognize things that you know. So if you're tasting and smelling something quite strongly, and that's the first thing that you can taste and smell, is because your brain is familiar with that flavor and that the aromatic sort of profile of it. Sometimes even when we're tasting as a group, when we're doing tastings for works, we've all got sort of different styles of palates. And Jeff's palate is quite different to Barry's palate, who's also quite different to me. And we can all sort of taste things, and I'll think of one thing first, and Barry might taste something and be like, oh, that is a bit funky. Jeff will taste it and be like, this is incredibly, this is great, this is really clean. And I sort of sit in the middle and I go, actually, now I've come round to it. Now it's kind of come round a little bit for me. It's like this, and it's quite an interesting sort of, it's quite interesting, and it's in a way quite hard to sort of characterize wines sometimes, because everybody's taste is so different as well. But it's an interesting area, sulfites, and I think something that I think people will be looking more into, hopefully. But yeah, as long as you don't think that not having sulfites isn't going to give you a hangover, because it's the alcohol that gives you the hangover, not the sulfites. I mean, they don't help. I'll be honest, they don't help if it's a.
The whole hangover thing is basically, the way I look at it is that it raises the threshold of. It's ultimately, like you said, it's alcohol, and if you drink enough of it, you're not going to feel great the next day. But I do believe that with natural wine, that threshold tends to be higher. Yeah. So I'm actually quite. I tend to get horrible hangovers. I don't drink that much as a result, which is great. But I can definitely drink a lot more natural wine than. I wouldn't dare drink like even half a bottle of conventional wine, I would feel
Yeah.
absolutely fine the next day. That's just my body. Yeah.
Yeah. I could only do that if I knew I wasn't doing anything the next day. But even so, I'd probably spend half a day in bed thinking, why did I do that? Yeah. But yeah, wine will give you a hangover whatever way. That's essentially the thing to take from that. Or alcohol will. That's essentially the thing from that. But yeah. So the next red. Are we ready for the next red?
Yes. So now we're going to Tuscany. So this is from an estate called Fattoria di Sammontana. These guys are in sort of in between Florence and Pisa. They're about 45 minutes west of Florence. So they're in the Chianti region, and they make a lot of really cool sort of experimental, like a lot of nods to ancient local winemaking traditions, some skin contact wines, orange wines, amphora, but they also do a really beautiful Chianti. And the reason we picked this wine for the lineup and to finish for the red is again, going back to this idea that just because a wine is natural doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be weird or funky, or, it can even taste kind of more along the slightly more classic line, right? Classic, not in a bad way, but in just maybe not classic, but I would say familiar, right? So I always say this is a Chianti that, that I love to drink. I think it's got beautiful purity. It's lighter than what you'd expect. It's got a lot more kind of fruit clarity than some of the ones that are like heavily oaked. But it's also a Chianti that you can put in front of, any kind of Chianti enthusiast, and I think it's a wine that has always like sold very well for us because of that reason. It's so versatile in terms of its profile. So it's 100% Sangiovese. It's from one single plot. So on the label, there's a kind of like a little drawing of that vineyard, so of that specific plot right there. Old vines, and it's vinified very traditionally. So these guys are a biodynamic estate, so very, very careful attention to the farming, very good quality fruit. And they only select the best ones for this wine. It's fermented in steel tanks, and then it's transferred into barrels, but old barrels. So the average age of the barrels is about 7 years old. Okay. And what happens, whenever I say, or if you hear people talk about old barrels versus new barrels, is that the older a barrel is, so the more times it's been filled, the less it will impart flavor onto the wine. So by the time it gets to about 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, you typically don't get any kind of oak or wood flavor in the wine. So this is average of 7 years old. So some of the barrels are a little bit younger. So this does have like a tiny, it's got like that hint of oak that's in the background, but it's dominated by the fruit, which is something that I really like about it. So it's aged in oak for 1 year, and then it's bottled, and then it's aged in bottle for at least 2 years at the winery before it's released. So this is the current vintage. It's a 2017 vintage. So this was bottled at the end of 2018, and it was released, if I remember correctly, this was released like towards the end of last year. And yeah, I think just very traditional Sangiovese character. I absolutely love Sangiovese. It's one of my favorite grape varieties because it's so versatile, but it just has such a unique flavor profile. It's one of the rare varieties that I can always pick out in like a blind tasting. Like blind tasting is so hard, but with Sangiovese, it's just, I don't know. It's just got such a strong personality variety. It's got like this meaty undernotes, like bright red fruits with a bit of kind of like spice, and I just think this is just such a lovely. But also quite serious example of Chianti. That's really, really good value for a naturally made Chianti that still tastes quite familiar and really delivers on quality. So you got a bit more body here. This is definitely kind of medium body sign.
Yeah.
But yeah, what do you think, Hannah?
I really like this wine. So I first had this wine last year in the first lockdown. I was like, I'm going to treat myself. And I had it, open, and I decanted it for an hour. And when I first opened it, at first there was like lots of quite bright cherry and like lots of sort of bright sort of fruit notes, and then it kind of went into more of that kind of herbaceous kind of character and a bit more spice. And then after an hour in the decanter, it was just singing. It was so beautiful, so sort of smooth and silky. Everything was really working in harmony with each other. And interesting as well about the oak, because I know that sort of Chianti and Tuscany, there is this kind of, there is quite a lot of use of oak in there, and it's something that you'll get with a lot of Chiantis and things like that, where they've oaked them for ages, and you get all that kind of real, like that, all that kind of woodiness coming through on it. But this is just very sort of subtle, and it doesn't feel like it's too dry. I think sometimes I find that if it's been oaked and for a long time, it can sometimes feel very, very dry and almost a little bit too much, where, you know, Sangiovese has that beautiful fruit characteristic as well, and I think this stops it from being lost within the oak. And yeah, it's a really lovely wine. This isn't a type of wine, like you said, if you put this in front of somebody who wasn't into natural wines at all, they wouldn't sort of sit there and go, well, this is natural and funky and I'm not drinking it. They sit there and be like, this is really lovely.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a slightly lighter style of Chianti, and like you said, very, very well judged use of oak. I'm not a big fan of oaky flavor in wine. I think it's something that's just changed for me over time. I think if I go back 10 years ago, I used to love that kind of like oaky, the oak flavor, because I always associated it with like complexity, because you get those additional flavor notes of kind of vanilla and coconut, and I think when I first started getting into it, I used to find that super interesting and exciting. It's like you need like a burst of flavor in the mouth, and but I think that over time, and especially discovering the more natural side of wine and the philosophy behind it and the concept of it, it's this idea that you have these growers spend the entire growing season, let's say, in like 9 months, 9+ months from the pruning to all the processes that lead to actually picking the grapes from the vines. Everything done manually, no sprays, everything natural. You have this amazing healthy fruit, and the whole concept of then throwing that into a vessel that's going to impart a whole bunch of flavor on it. There's kind of a disconnect. For me, there's just a disconnect in those two facts. Again, very subjective, and some people love that style, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I love a wine that is complex because of the quality of the raw material solely, and the efforts of the winemaker to shape that wine to its journey, to express that site, to express that place, without the use of any kind of heavy-handed winemaking, or without the use of a particular vessel that's going to change that flavor profile. And when it comes to so for me, it's a shame that you get these amazing vineyards and then the wines end up being super oaked, because my nose just goes straight to the oak, and if the oak is there, I can't focus on what makes that wine special, aside from the fact that it's got this like unnatural flavoring added to it. So that's one side of it. And then on the other hand, you can have like a very poor quality wine that's just been thrown into a brand new oak barrel as sort of makeup. So it's kind of like this, this extra thing that's been added to it to try and correct its flaws, or to hide, the quality of the fruit. So I think that a wine that can be truly complex and super expressive without the use of any kind of outside flavoring, for me, that's like the ultimate wine. But again, just my my preference.
It's interesting you say that about oak. So yesterday there's a winery, a South African winery that we stock called Avondale, which I think is through Cachet Wines, and they had a sort of meet the winemaker over Zoom. So Jonathan from Avondale went through the wines, went through his vineyard, and he is very dynamic in his practices, very natural in the cellar and things as well. Makes some very lovely wines that, again, like this sort of Sangiovese, that aren't necessarily crazy funky, that what people might say is a little bit more traditional. But what was one of the things that was quite interesting is he said he loves using barrels, but he hates oak. And it's quite an interesting sort of concept. And I think you sort of see with a lot of sort of natural wines is that the use of oak is done in a very sort of restrained way. And from the sort of things that I've had personally, and from what you've just been talking about, Nic, as well, is that that oak can be used to sort of hide a lot of flaws, or it can be used to kind of benefit a wine in a way where it might not be the best quality, or if you've got, as you say, if you've got this lovely pure fruit that you've spent months looking after, and you've hand harvested it, which is an incredibly laborious process. It's not easy hand harvesting. It's kind of seems a bit silly to then go ahead and go, you know what, I'm just going to put this in new American oak, and then you get your vanilla and butterscotch and coconut, and that's the first thing you kind of smell on it. So yeah, I think it seems to be that I have sort of found that natural wines tend to just be a little bit more restrained on the oak, and they're definitely more about the kind of oxidation of it, as opposed to imparting loads of kind of woody flavors onto it.
I think, like I said, absolutely nothing wrong with the use of new oak, if that's your stylistic preference. The beauty of wine is that it's everyone has different tastes, everyone has different things that excites them about wine, and so and that's important. That's the spice of life, right? So I think it's great, and which is why I want to stress, like, oak is not my preference, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with using that in wine if that's what you like. But yes, with natural winemaking, because there's so much care that goes into growing those grapes, that I think people are much more restrained in the use of anything that's going to alter the flavor of that place.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think as you said, you started off really loving oak and then kind of moving away from it. I think I'm kind of going along that same path as well. When I sort of first started in wine about 6 years ago, I remember having South African Chardonnay that was like full of malolactic fermentation and been aged in oak, and it was this big buttery, creamy, vanilla-y sort of flavor. And I remember drinking it with my friends and going, "This is great," and all of them were like, what are you drinking? It's like drinking butter. And now if I went back to that, I'd probably find it just a little bit too intense and a bit too powerful. And I think personally for me, that sort of more restrained character is good, but sometimes people, they like the kind of big full stuff. But yeah, I just think it's quite interesting how most kind of natural wines that I've had tend to be a little bit more restrained on the oak. And I suppose it's a reflection of their grapes, isn't it? And their vineyards. So yeah, but yeah, this Chianti it's really lovely. It's fantastic. They're all lovely. I keep saying
it's a great all-rounder. It's a proper rustic Italian red. I like Italian wines. I think this just ticks all the boxes. And I love Italian wine. I'm obsessed with it.
I mean, yeah, there's so much to explore with Italian wine, isn't there? I think it always baffles me when people say, "Oh, I don't like wine from a particular country," and especially if it's somewhere like Italy, I'm like, well, you can't say that. You just can't say that. There's too much to know about it. So, yeah.
Well, I truly believe that there is, like you said, people say I don't like wine from this region, or I don't like wine from this grape. I really believe that there are absolutely amazing wines for everybody in every country, in every growing region, and made from every grape variety, because there's such a variety from that. And I think that's a perfect lead into this next wine that we're going to try now, which is from Slovakia. So a region that I'm sure many people aren't necessarily very familiar with when it comes to wine. But, Eastern Europe, I think, is definitely, Eastern Europe produces some absolutely amazing wines. There's no question about that. There's I think there's a real resurgence of wines coming from the region, especially within the kind of natural wine scene. Because it's this concept of, I'll touch on that in a minute, but I'll quickly talk about the wine so people can taste it and give a bit of background. But this is so it's a small estate. It's about half an hour east of Bratislava, so in Slovakia, and it's made from a variety. It's made from a variety called Gruner Veltliner, which some of you might be familiar with because it's a very common grape associated with Austria, but really it's a variety that's quite common in the whole of what used to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Of course, Austria, where it's become more popular, where it's become better known as, but then also places like Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary. You often find this grape variety under slightly different names. these guys, Slobodne, super interesting project, very fascinating history. But they are, for me, like masters of orange wine. So we haven't really had a proper orange wine on this lineup yet. And I think no natural wine tasting would be complete without a bit of orange wine. So this is actually one of my favorite ones that they make. I find it to be one of the more refined, more delicate and subtle examples. But it has their absolute trademark style. I think all of their orange wines are so fresh, so accessible, hardly any tannins, very smooth. They have this drinkability that I always find is just sublime. This is a wine that spent 2 weeks fermenting on the skin. So like I explained earlier, we were talking about the Er Giancu. So 2 weeks on the skins, and then this is then aged in old Hungarian oak barrels for 2 years, and then 1 year in bottle. So again, 2017 vintage. So it's got quite a little bit of age on it, and it's just, for me, it's just so expressive. There's something so unique about it and enticing. It's got like it's almost like tea leaf. I get a lot of like tea leaf and sort of slight apricot, but then with citrus as well. It's got good acidity. It's got proper like fruit concentration, but it's all within this very lean and light kind of body. And that's something that always fascinates me. I love a wine that feels very light on the palate, but that still delivers in flavor intensity. And I think this is just, bombs of flavor, but in a very restrained kind of way.
For me, it's almost like blood orange, as if someone's got blood. I don't know, like it's got that like orange peel and that's like bitterness, but then it's really bright and vibrant as well, and like, but more so than orange. It's not just orange. It's like a more intense orange, but also restrained at the same time. I know that sounds like an oxymoron saying that it's intense but also restrained at the same time. But
no, but that's kind of what I was trying to explain as well. Yeah, it's intense but so elegant.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the wines that these guys make are just so interesting. So they're making wine. It's 2 sisters and their 2 partners. So the 4 of them run this 350 hectare farm. It's a mixed farm. They grow wheat, barley, linseed, rapeseed. They have animals, and they have 17 hectares of vines. And they're making wine in the same cellar as their great uncle did in the early part of the 20th century. And there's kind of been it was a really fractured and tragic sort of broken history of the estate. They lost everything in World War II, and then that was followed almost immediately by 40 years of communism in the region. So it was kind of like this farm that belonged to this family was this unspoken thing that was just never mentioned, that like never existed, like this kind of like remnant of this tragic past. And then when communism fell in the late 80s, people were given I think it was a 3-year window in Czechoslovakia at the time, 3 years to produce evidence of any property that might have belonged to family or to ancestors. And by absolutely sheer luck, they happened to have some papers that proved that this farm, belonged to their family. And so the current winemaker's parents were able to recover the land, and then in the early 90s, and then spend the better part of the last 30 years basically just rebuilding that whole ecosystem, very slowly and gradually replanting everything. And it's now a fully operational, bustling farm. Lovely, fascinating people. Going to visit there is like stepping into the past. Like it's there's a unique feeling there that I've never experienced in any other winery. It's very particular. But a big part of what they do is to really look for these ancient winemaking traditions. So a lot of the skin contact, using a lot of local varieties. They use varieties called Devin, Traminer, Ali Bernet, Blaufränkisch. So they really seek those kind of varieties that were previously quite dominant in the area. And I think the reason why we haven't heard too much about Eastern Europe generally is because wine is something that's just been so traditional, right? If you think about France, Italy, Spain, there's a couple centuries. I mean, obviously there's thousands of years of winemaking history, but couple centuries of like actual tradition of certain grape varieties in certain regions, or or just knowledge that's handed down from generation to generation to generation. But obviously, with communism having happened, from the late 40s to the late 80s, that's basically enough time. 40 years is enough time to basically wipe out a generation. If you think about it, when it comes to winemaking and when it comes to passing on tradition and passing on grape varieties. So that's been one part of it. And then also the fact that during the communist times, a lot of the grapes, the idea with, obviously wine was made and grapes were grown, but it was all about quantity and not quality. So a lot of these old varieties that were like lower yielding or that were maybe harder to grow were basically ripped out and replaced with like, bulk high yield varieties for a very like standard kind of bland style of wine. And so you have all this tradition that just vanished and disappeared. So when communism fell, then people started to, rebuild their wineries and start again and privatize, their land. I guess my perception of it is that a lot of people just looked to the West at that time and looked at Bordeaux, Burgundy, how are these people doing things, and planted Cabernet and Pinot Noir and all these varieties. And so I think in the 90s and maybe even all the way through to the early 2000s, and even still going on now, there's a lot of wine that comes from there is made with that sort of, I don't know, maybe like that's what people look for in the wines, but there's
catering to a particular audience that, they get people interested in it by doing things that they already know, like a Pinot Noir or something like that.
But I think I actually think the natural wine movement in those regions, in Austria, in Slovakia, in Czech Republic, in Hungary, and then slowly starting now in places like Bulgaria, obviously Georgia, that's going, a lot further east, but Georgia has traditions that never disappeared, but I think that the natural wine scene in those places is really helping to reshape the perception of like what is wine from that region, what makes that region so unique, what are these varieties that really define those wines. And for me, Slobodne, and by the way, Slobodne means freedom or free winery, so it's kind of a nod to this like heritage and history of the estate. But I do believe they're kind of like at the forefront, part of this sort of group of 5 to 10 winemakers that are really helping to put those regions and those countries on the map.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, like that Slovakia is literally on the border of Austria, and when you actually look at where the vineyards of both Austria and Slovakia sit, they are pretty much next to each other as well. And Austrian wine in the UK is a more prominent thing, and we get people after sort of Austrian wines, but it seems like as soon as you just go a little bit further to the west, to the east, a little bit further to east, people are like, oh, Slovakia, they make wine. And it's like, well, if you look at the actual geography of it, then it makes a lot of sense. And it's one of those, I think people are always quite surprised. So we've got some Romanian wine, which is hugely popular. And there's still people that are kind of surprised at the fact that they're like, oh, you can get wine from Romania. And it's like, it's quite a big area for it now. And it does seem like there's more coming out of the area. I think people are kind of slowly getting used to the idea that wine is not just old world and new world, and it's not just France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and then new world is like Chile and Argentina, and the Americas and Australia, etc. They're starting to realize that, hey, there's wine made all over. You can make, wherever you can farm, you can essentially grow vines. Certain sort of grape varieties suit certain areas, and just because that's not something we're conventionally used to, sort of Eastern European wines, and that being a wine making region, but they farm, they can make great they've got great produce out there as well, so they can make great wines. And this is a really good example. And in terms of an orange wine as well, it's a really, like you say, it's just so juicy and there's so much to it. Like I don't even know where to start with it.
It's quite a wine. I'm a huge fan of this wine. I think it's such precise style of winemaking as well. Super clean, very, 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 very expressive. and like we said in the beginning, complex but still accessible. You can either sit there, it has everything you want in a wine that you sit there and think about and nerd out with your wine, with people who are really into wine, but at the same time, it's also a wine that's just so enjoyable to just drink and not think too much about.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. And just, you touched on briefly sort of Georgia and their winemaking techniques, and I think one thing that we've seen in the past sort of year as well is that people are really getting into the idea of orange wine, and they're really kind of intrigued by orange wine. We've got a range of customers that some people are really into orange wine. They've had many of these before. They know what they're like, and they know what they like personally. And then other people who are just starting out, and they're kind of like, is it made from oranges? Is that how it gets made? And you kind of have to explain it. And then when you sort of explain that actually it's a really ancient technique, it's quite a surprise to them. So Georgia was actually making orange wine, or wine in this technique for many thousands of years. What do you think? There's any particular reason that that's kind of come back into sort of fashion, I guess, and that it's kind of come back into circulation again? Or do you think people are kind of, as natural wine has become more of a prominent thing, do you think people are looking to the past at times when technology wasn't around to help with their winemaking, and sort of seeing how they kind of did things and what sort of, and kind of letting that influence them, I suppose?
Well, I think part of the reason you're seeing them a lot more is definitely directly related to the fact that natural wine has had quite, it has become such an important movement.
Yeah.
And so, and has become a style of wine that's been so sought after, and that has brought so many new people into the world of wine.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of orange wine kind of came back into popularity. What was repopularized by natural winemakers, kind of looking for ancient vinification techniques. Although nowadays, because orange wine is becoming so popular, there's a lot of conventional winemakers who are kind of jumping on board and making their own versions. And so, just because the wine is orange doesn't always mean it's natural anymore. So I think that's one part of the reason why you're seeing them a lot more, is just the popularity of the natural wine movement. But I think the more important reason is that they're just delicious. So, but if you think about it, it's a simple reason. I always say, orange wines, you have to think about it as its own category. It's not a red, it's not a white, it's not a rosé. It's an orange wine, or skin contact wine, or amber wine, or whatever however you want to refer to it. And it's so, being in its own category, there's a huge range of orange wines. There's some that are, like this one that we're having now. There's some that are a lot more tannic, a lot more concentrated. There's some that are even much, much lighter. I mean, the Er Giancu technically is an orange wine. It's 25 days on skins. Actually much longer skin contact than this one, but that's a lot lighter in color. Huge range of styles, and I think that the fact, essentially it's a kind of a genre that almost disappeared in the early 20th century. I think as technology, evolved and people had more access to presses and ways of making white wine. But if you go back 200, 300, 400 years, my guess is that there was basically two types of wine. There was red wine and orange wine, because all wine was made the same way. So all wine was fermented on the skin. So if you had white grapes, you'd have orange wine. If you had red wine, you had red grapes, you'd have red wine. And so I think that the fact that this style, that people are able to taste so many examples of this style, has just made it popular because it's so fascinating. It's flavors that you've never tried in wine before. It's textures that you associate with red wine, but with the acidity and the freshness and the temperature of a white wine. It's wildly exciting. They're wines that pair amazingly with food because they're so versatile, because they sit in that kind of in-between range. So to answer your question, I think natural wine and the rise of natural wine has meant that a lot more orange wines have been made available from everywhere in the world, but also the fact that they're so good and so interesting has really helped with that popularity. Yeah.
And you just said about briefly just food. What would you recommend pairing with this? I mean, this is a super food friendly wine. I think you could get away with all sorts with it. I don't really put a list out of everything in one go, but
I would say, yeah, nothing too. I would basically say it's more about, maybe I'll touch on the things not to pair with. I wouldn't go with anything too bold in flavor, right? Because it would probably overpower the wine. There's a certain delicate kind of touch to this wine that I think is important. I think with salads, it would be fantastic. I think if you eat meat, something like pork, like
I was going to say
a pork dish would be really good. Even anything that's got like a little hint of sweetness in it, like whether it's like a slightly like a raspberry sauce on something, or like a fish dish, but nothing too creamy. So no sort of creamy sauces. A bit of spice as well would work really well with this. Again, going back to kind of curry, things like that.
I was thinking that like a gently spiced sort of curry that's not necessarily creamy, but more like a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? More like a grill or something, like a sort of a curry spice. But summer's day though would also work well in the sun. But yeah, it's a really interesting wine. I think orange wine as a category is it's growing definitely. It's definitely growing. It's something people are intrigued by and they want to know more about it.
I don't know if you can still hear me, but
yes,
you have frozen for me.
Oh, have I? Sorry.
Oh, you're back.
There we go.
You froze there for a second.
Well, that'll be fun. I'll try and cut that out in the video later. But yeah, as a category, it's a very intriguing sort of thing, and I think for customers, it's something different, something quite unusual compared to sort of conventional wines. But yeah, it's something that it's sort of growing, and people are looking into exploring more, and kind of coming around to the idea that yes, wine can be orange, and that can be quite a normal thing and quite a traditional way of making it as well. So yeah. Oh, I think Nic, you've frozen for me now as well.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. There we go. I'm frozen. Okay. But we've come to the end of the flight anyway, so we are at the end of it now. Usually I like to ask what the favorite was from people, but I'm not sure I could actually pick a favorite because they're all so different and they've got so much character to them. But if you do have a favorite, do let us know. Price wise of the last three, I just realized I didn't do. I think this one is about 30, the Chianti is about 23, and the orange is about 30 as well. But yeah, and I think Nic, can you still hear me or not? Frozen. You're frozen. I can hear you, but the picture's got sort of frozen off.
Oh right. Okay.
Yeah.
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, that's as long as you can hear me. But yeah, I think usually, like I say, there's a kind of favorite, but I don't really know how you choose a favorite out of these because they're all very different for different occasions, and yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I don't think I couldn't. I suppose on a day like today, maybe the Pomagrana or the Supermajer would be fantastic, but then the Riesling was also fantastic as well. So yeah, there's not really one I could sort of point as like.
It's always a good sign,
Yeah, I was going to say I'm not going to ask you what your favorite is because I'm sure that's like picking between trying to pick between your favorite child. So. Yeah,
no, it's not that. It's just I think wine it all depends on the mood and the occasion and who you're with, and so a wine for every occasion. Yeah, exactly. I think there's some things which I really like and are kind of go-to wines, but as you say, there's a wine for every occasion and a grape for every occasion, and a style of wine for every occasion as well, and for every palate as well, which is yeah. So I think on that note, I think we will probably leave it there. If anybody has any other questions that they think of afterwards, or if you are watching it later and you've got any questions, do let us know. I can always put them forward to Nic, or we can always do our best to answer them. The wines that we tasted today, we've got in stock at the moment. Some of them are quite limited in stock as well. So if there's anything that you really like, oh yeah, I really, really would like that, let us know and we can always pop something aside as well. But yeah, so I hope everyone's enjoyed it. It's been really, really great talking to you, Nic. It's been a really lovely insight into kind of natural wines and the whole umbrella of natural wines, and kind of what they
mean within conventional winemaking and wine today. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. I know you're incredibly busy at the moment as well.
Thank
so,
you.
Get your time for that. So yeah.
It's been a pleasure, and I hope I hope the viewers learn something and maybe discover something new.
I've certainly learned something. So yeah. Well, lovely. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your evening. And yeah, hopefully everyone can stay cool. Hopefully this will help everyone cool off this evening. So anyway, thanks everyone. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.